So, Lecture 8, Respiration. If by breath alone I can be a bigger man, how ephemeral. This alludes to the underlying mechanics of breath. It's simply changing the volume of the cavity of our chest. And by increasing the volume of our chest, we're causing a negative pressure, drawing air into our chest. This is the process of ventilation, which is part of respiration. All right, let's go back to Galen, our pal. So what did he say in his Amazon bestseller? Blood passing through the lungs absorbed from the inhaled air the quality of coolness, which it then carried into the left heart. So here, once again, we see the lasting impact of Aristotle and his Aristotle's elements, the notion that the universe is made of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and that there was an innate heat in the body, an innate element of fire that composed the human, and that it needed to be cooled by exposure to air, which had air was the pure expression of air, one of the four elements, and by so doing, tempering that. And so he understood that the lungs were directly connected to the heart, and indeed, he even had much of the plumbing correct, that the pulmonary veins left the lungs and carried the blood to the left chamber of the heart. So an early understanding of the fundamental plumbing, even if he had the underlying ontology kind of wrong. And then his foil in Da Vinci, who we've actually made fun of a little bit in earlier slides, quote, the substance of the lung is dilatatable and extensible, like the tinder made from a fungus, but it is spongy, and if you press it, it yields the force which compresses it. And if the force is removed, it increases again to its original size. The material scientist in Leonardo wondering at the foamy substance of the lung. I should go get that I should have had the lung up there for today for you guys to play with. It is pretty incredible stuff. All right. So this guy Harvey, who I've paraded across the screen here previously, from the UK, says, life and respiration are complementary. There's nothing living which does not breathe, nor anything which breathing does not live. All right. So to him, breath indeed indicated it was like one of the fundamental aspects of life. Breath is life. And by which breathing, we provide some sort of nourishment to the body through the blood. So he's taking what Galen says, and Galen says, like, we just need to get some coolness in the body, or else we like build up heat or whatever. And Harvey says, well, not actually. There is something more that we're actually getting here. There's some kind of nourishment. There's some critical component in the environment, in the air, that is essential to life. And of course, this is going to be oxygen. But he wasn't quite there. 1653, still fairly early on. They hadn't really established. It wasn't until Anton Lavoisier in the late 18th century finally put an arrow in the bubble of Aristotle's elements by defining an element to be a chemical that is irreducible. All right, so that's the origins. Let's move forward to our pal Osler. Now I pointed out Osler as well. Harvey and Osler, I put them together previously. He was the first physiologist. Physy, not fizzy. This is not me trying to say physiology with a lisp. Physiology is PHTH. How's that for what is that? A diphthong? a blend of some sort. Physiology, physiology, was the study of tuberculosis. And the study of tuberculosis is how modern pulmonology got started, or the study of lungs. This happened when he founded in the mid-19th century the National Association for the Study and Prevention of Tuberculosis. Careless spitting, coughing, sneezing spreads influenza and tuberculosis. Indeed it does. And tuberculosis is a major problem, was a major problem in the United States, still is a major problem globally. I think that we're going to hear a talk from one of the groups about extreme drug-resistant tuberculosis and HIV. We're also, I can also comment that 1/3 of the global population is likely to be infected with some latent tuberculosis. So it's one of the most widespread diseases on Earth. Real challenge for the future. It's a major challenge that you guys will have to deal with. All right. So another thing was polio and poliomyelitis. Now this is a degeneration of the nerves, which caused a de-innervation of the diaphragm, the phrenic nerve, and the other muscles of respiration. Poliomyelitis. For example, what was his name there? FDR in his wheelchair. He had polio and had lost the ability to walk. Well, they had these people. It used to be a death sentence, but then along came the iron lungs produced by Drinker and Shaw in 1928, right after World War I. And what these were these chambers where you go in. These people were paralyzed; they couldn't move, and then would be a negative pressure in the tank, which would just suck on your body and forcibly expand your chest, and then a positive pressure would come and push down on your chest, and so whereby it would draw air into your mouth and out of your mouth. Can you imagine up here in the corner? Look at these little children struck down by polio, stuck forever on their backs in these negative chamber iron lungs. As horrifying as that may seem, at least they're alive, I guess, and waiting for Jonas Salk to come up with the vaccine. Yeah, this was an interesting sort of Twilight Zone chapter in the fight against polio. All right. Alveoli. So it's all about this right here. This is where we get gas exchange. What's amazing about this, in a healthy person, not a person who's smoking or emphysematous or asthmatic perhaps, your alveoli represent 35 times the surface area of your body. That's incredible. If you were able to take your lung out and then stretch it out, you could cover 35 people in it. It's amazing. All right, so my objectives for the day here, we're gonna I'm just gonna like flash the respiratory anatomy in front of you real quickly. I'll talk about asthma and chronic occlusive pulmonary disease just a bit, ventilation and gas exchange. Oh, I have these dates on here. These dates don't pay attention to those. Hemoglobin, and the bulk of the day today is going to be about this. I'm going to talk about saturation dynamics and carbon dioxide. And then I'm going to scare you with some pictures of lung cancer, if I get to it. I may not. All right. So here's the anatomy. You ask people what the respiratory system does, and they say, well, it helps you breathe. It's respiration, and how you get oxygen in there. Well, it does actually a lot of things. Olfaction is the job of the nasal cavity. Phonation, or the generation of sound, is the larynx. That's part of the respiratory system. And then it protects the respiratory surfaces using this mucociliary escalator. And then, of course, we do have gas exchange. And that gas exchange is facilitated by ventilation, or the movement of air to these exchange surfaces. All right. So here is a cross-section of what looks like, to me, Jean-Luc Picard's face. And we see in this cross-section, we see these nasal concha. So here's the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. And you can see why they're called concha, right? Because they have this sort of curled structure that creates turbulence in the air that's inhaled during breathing, enabling particulates to hit the surface, odorants to be dissolved into the mucus and sensated. Now, this looks like a pretty tortuous path there. However, if you were to look, for example, at the cross-section, similar cross-section of a seal, through the rostrum of a seal or a dog or something like that, it's amazing. Sometime Google an image. You can see what those turbinates look like. It's something different. It's really highly curly, very labyrinthine nasal cavities in those critters, corresponding to their enhanced ability to smell. All right, so then descending, looking at the epithelium of the nasal cavity and trachea, this is the superficial view, right? So these are all these cilia that are part of this mucus elevator, the mucociliary escalator. But what happens is particles adhere to that, and then they get conducted up to the mouth where you expectorate them. This high surface area with all of this fuzzy stuff here also helps to moisten and warm the air that you breathe to protect the delicate surfaces of the respiratory epithelium. All right, so let's look a little bit closer as a cartoon detail. We have this adventitia, or the lamina propria. This is all connective tissue here with a layer of epithelium on top of it. So this is a tissue membrane, right? It's got a layer of epithelium with a layer of connective tissue underneath. All right? One of the four types. I said there was cutaneous, serous, and mucus. Oh man, what was the fourth one? I don't remember. Synovial. In this layer of epithelium, we have some mucus cells, these so-called goblet cells embedded, and they're going to release mucus onto the surface along with some mucus glands that we'll see elsewhere. Here is a mucus cell, and you can see that it's going to release this out on the surface of that ciliated epithelium. And then a little bit of smudge, some coal dust or whatever is going to adhere to the mucus and be shuttled upwards. All right. And here's what it looks like in closer inspection in the trachea. So here, these are the columnar epithelium with all their cilia, and then we can see these goblet cells interspersed along there, the mucus glands that are going to release all this mucus. There are other mucus glands that are more deeply embedded here in the adventitia and the connective tissue layer that are going to communicate with the external surface as well. And then lying below them is going to be this hyaline cartilage ring. So Alan, for example, was looking at the slide in lab today. You can go and find it. There is this tracheal cartilage with a layer of connective tissue and then a layer of thin layer of ciliated epithelium that you can see in that slide. All right, so lungs, what's the function here? Well, obviously gas exchange, that's the obvious one. But they're also helping you regulate the pH of your body, the acid balance. How do you do that? Well, by blowing off carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide is dissolved in your blood, the more carbonic acid will form, driving the pH down. So, for example, when you are in acidosis, this is why you tend to breathe hard. All right, and what sends you into acidosis? Well, exercise would. Or when you're hyperventilating, your pH, you're going into alkalosis, and you have people breathe into a bag and drive more carbon dioxide into their blood and help to lower their pH and slow their breathing. Okay, does that make sense? It also helps defend against various pathogens. I talked about the mucociliary escalator that deals with the particles that you may inhale. But antibodies and eosinophils, which we've talked about in the past, antibodies and eosinophils also are fully investing the respiratory tissue and helping to deal with any particles. Because 35 times the surface area of your body, that's a pretty big piece of turf to deal with, right? I mean, if you imagine your skin and you're trying to deal with infections in different places in your skin, if you have 35 times that surface area to monitor in the lungs, that you can imagine that there's going to be a fairly high density of white blood cells and antibodies, and immune components there. 20% of your blood is actually in your lungs. There's a lot of blood there. It's a large volume that's richly invested with blood vessels. And then beyond all that, the lungs have a role in the endocrine system. So there's a number of things that happen there. This is where we create leukotrienes, which are inflammatory hormones. You activate angiotensin. You activate angiotensinogen to angiotensin there, which is a peptide that has effect on vasoconstriction. And you're going to break down epinephrine and serotonin in the lungs. So any serotonin or epinephrine that is circulating in the lungs gets catabolized by the tissue of the lungs. So the lungs do have lots of other functions besides just exchanging gas. Here's what they look like. I'm not going to recapitulate all the anatomy that we just learned, but I will show you a couple things of note on this slide. First of all, you can see each of these tertiary bronchi that form the lobules is colored in yellow. So you could probably count up the number of tertiary bronchioles colored in different colors, right? You can count up the number of tertiary bronchioles involved in the lung. And the medium bronchi are the principal site of air resistance. All right, so if you think about the cross-sectional area, if you think about the cross-sectional area of the diameter of the tree at any one point, and you compare that cross-sectional area, that profile, so like moving from left to right down the tree in a graph, you would see it go from higher to lower and then back up again. So like that cross-sectional area in the middle bronchial tree is where you have the principal amount of resistance. So that's going to be from like here to here. That sum of that cross-sectional area is a little bit lower, and you have a higher degree of resistance. So that's going to be where the autonomic nervous system is going to be able to really control the access of air to the respiratory system. All right, is at these like intermediate levels of the bronchial tree, because that's the bottleneck anyways. And so releasing it or further constricting it is best done here at the bottleneck. And this is done by the autonomic nervous system or any kind of irritants that are going to cause some intrinsic endocrine function right there on site. Bronchodilation is where the air passages get wider, as you would guess. That happens by the sympathetic autonomics. Sympathetic being the fight or flight. That should make sense. You've got what's the boogeyman that we were talking about? The werewolf senator is running after you, so you need to move oxygen to the lungs as quickly as you can, and sympathetic nervous system does it. Bronchoconstriction, parasympathetic nervous system, listening to that same senator talk may put you to sleep and stimulate bronchoconstriction. Why am I picking on senators? I don't know. Bronchitis and asthma. Here are a couple different reasons, different ways that your lungs can mess with you. Bronchitis, first of all, is simply just an inflammation of the bronchial wall, and it's going to cause a constriction of the air passage. So this happens by, here's one, an inflammation of the bronchial epithelium. And this can either be due to an infection, or it can be because of chronic occlusive pulmonary disease, emphysema. Does anybody have a person with emphysema in their family? Yeah, probably like your grandpa or something like that. Yeah. Well, 10 million people in the U.S. have it. 10 million people. That's like 3% of the U.S. population. That's a pretty big number of people. It's like 1 in 30. There's, it's a pretty big number. And over 40,000 people die just because of their inability to breathe, not because of lung cancer or any of that, just because of their inability to breathe. 40,000 people die from COPD every year. Asthma is another thing that can lead to the constriction of the airways. It is an atopic disease. So there's 4 types of allergic hypersensitivity, type 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it is it's a type 2 hypersensitivity, I believe. There are a bunch of different type 2 hypersensitivities. Atopic dermatitis or eczema is one. Atopic rhinitis or hay fever, asthma, etc. And really, what that is on the molecular level, it's your immune system. The part of your immune system that has been designed to deal with parasites, oddly, has been designed to deal with parasites. You didn't get a parasitic infection, and that part of the immune system never got stimulated or never got trained properly, because we live in a fairly hyperhygienic world, and our immune system originally developed in a much less hygienically controlled environment, and we needed that part of the immune system, but most people, at least in the developed world, do not have chronic parasitic challenge. So it has to do something, and it causes asthma. So this part of the immune system mistakes irritants, or what we would call allergens, for proteins that would be associated with some kind of a parasite, and mounts an immune response to that allergen. So if you think about it, all those things I just described, atopic dermatitis, atopic rhinitis, asthma, another one is atopic gastritis or, food allergy. Those are all surfaces that we come in contact with the external world, right? The surface of your lungs, the surface of your skin, your sinuses, your GI tract. Those are all places where we come into contact with the outside world. And that's where you would get a parasitic infection. There is an interesting this interesting story about this guy has anyone heard about this guy who gives himself hookworm? There's a guy who had really bad asthma, and he went, and so understanding what I just described, he went to Africa and walked around barefoot in a bunch of latrines over there and got himself, luckily, only a case of hookworm. Seems like a bit of a risk, but got himself a humdinger of a case of hookworm, which, hookworm, I don't remember all of the life stages of hookworm, but I think crawls in through your skin and your feet, goes through your bloodstream, ends up in the lungs, and then hangs out there, matures there, and then you expectorate it and swallow it, and it goes into your GI tract and lodges there and then has a little blood feast. But it's the stage where it's in your, super charming. Parasites are so charming. It's when it's in your lungs that it elicits an immune response there. This guy sent his asthma into total remission with this case of hookworm that he gave himself. So what he then did is he isolated the hookworm larva from his feces, because you expectorate it and swallow it, and wanted to start a company selling hookworms to people with asthma. But the FDA was like, no, that's not going to happen. And he moved. I don't remember which side of the border, whether it was Canada or Mexico. I think he moved to Vancouver because the guy was smart. Not that Mexico's not lovely. I would love to live anywhere in Mexico, but Vancouver is great. And I think he moved to Vancouver and, started his business there. So there's a story. Asthma. Asthma can happen at any point in your life. So I used to get a little bit of cold-induced asthma when I would run as a kid, so I didn't run in the cold. I didn't like that. And that's really common. Some people may find that to be the case when we do the metabolic analysis lab next week with Dawn. In the last year, we got a puppy dog at my house, and we've had dogs for years. And just in the last year, I've developed asthma in response to this dog, which is a real bummer to me. But it can happen at different points in your life. They give albuterol, this is beta adrenergic bronchodilator. I've never used that. I just stay away from the dog. But it stimulates adrenergic receptors and in the smooth muscles of the bronchi, the intermediate bronchi, and then dilates them and opens up those air passageways. All right. So I've already made this point. I've dawdled too long, so I'm going to skip this slide. Not that this isn't important, but I covered this in the lab. Pulmonary blood pressure. So in the cardiac chapter, we talked about the two sort of parallel circulatory systems. There's the right side of the heart that's sending the blood to the lungs, and then there's the left side of the heart that's sending the blood to the rest of the body, right? And the blood pressure you guys measured with the sphygmomanometer on your arms, that was systemic circulation. And what was a typical blood pressure, like 110/70 or something like that? So the mean pulmonary pressure is around 30 millimeters of mercury. Much lower. Because of that, since there's lower pressure there, the pulmonary system is more prone to having things thrown into it. So the pulmonary vessels are easily blocked by blood clots, fat, air bubbles, any kind of thing that then can go and form these pulmonary embolisms. So I guess this is pointing out a few emboli. So like this structure. These are, I guess, like this would be pulmonary trunk coming through here in the bifurcation, and these are blocking those passageways. This is like, I don't know the exact number, but it's a really high percentage of the time. This happens in people with what's called a PFO. Have I already talked about PFOs? Patent foramen ovalis. So this is when the foramen ovale doesn't fully seal after birth. I keep dancing around it. I should just dive in and show you a diagram of fetal circulation so you'll understand better. But basically, when those of you who found the fossa ovalis in utero, that's open, right? The foramen ovale of the heart, and blood clots are able to, or whatever, air bubbles or something. If there are any, they're more likely to get pushed into the pulmonary circulation because of the low blood pressure on that side, and then they localize to the lung. Not fun. Good, easy way to die. All right, so let's get down to the important business of breathing here. Gas exchange begins in these respiratory bronchioles. Here's a respiratory bronchiole. It's a respiratory bronchiole because it still has bronchiolar integrity, and with a few alveoli coming off of it, and then bronchiolar integrity breaks down, and we have just a collection of alveoli from the duct, which terminates in these sacs, which is just a big arrangement of alveoli at the end of the duct. So that's the anatomy, right? Let's look at a cartoon closely and see what we have. So for respiration to work, when you breathe, you don't breathe in and hold your breath for 30 seconds and then release it, waiting for that gas to exchange, do you? We just breathe fairly quickly, right? A breath comes fairly quickly. So that means that the oxygen needs to exchange rapidly. For that to happen, you don't want the oxygen to have to go over hill and dale to get into your blood. You want to keep the blood as close to the air that has been delivered to the lung by ventilation as possible. So the alveolar surface here that's covered with these what are called pneumocytes, pneumo, P-N-E-U, meaning lung, pneumocyte, lung cells. There's two types. There's type 1, which is the vast majority of them. They're simple squamous epithelium, simple flat layer squamous, squashed down, very thin, squashed down, single layer of epithelium. The simple squamous epithelium are in close contact with the endothelium of these capillaries. They're like really complex capillary meshwork that surrounds all these alveoli. Right? Then, the problem would be that the surface of these pneumocytes needs to be moist. It needs to be moist so the cells can stay healthy and help dissolve the oxygen. But moisture implies water, right? And water has a high surface tension, okay? Water beads. It has a high surface tension. So if this surface was moist, water would bead up on the surface of that epithelium. To prevent that, we have these septal cells, or pneumocyte type 2 cells. These septal cells are interspersed. The job of these septal cells, septal meaning they live in the septum between they live in the septum between alveoli, in between the capillaries. So the capillaries are at the junctions and of multiple ones, and then the septal cells are at the walls between two. So this is a junction between three here, between three alveoli, and then the septum between two, we have the septal cells. They produce a surfactant that reduces the surface tension of the water. It's a oily secretion that breaks up the surface tension of the water. This surfactant is made of various phospholipids and other proteins. It's actually quite complex. One of them, for example, is called dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. Dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, DPPC. Much easier to say. A complex lecithin-derived amphiphile. Okay. What else do I want to point out? Oh, there's also these macrophages that are zooming around looking for bugs. Those are there as well. Okay. Let's look at the actual respiratory membrane. So here is the inside of a capillary. Here's the inside of an alveolus, the airspace. So we're going to have the capillary epithelium and the alveolar epithelium. They have a fused basement membrane. So the basement membrane of those two epithelial cells are fused right together. All right? So that the distance from one compartment to the next is less than half a micrometer. Super teeny tiny. So 1 micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. All right, a millimeter is like the thickness of your fingernail is probably like 1.5 millimeters, right? So, or maybe 2 millimeters. So imagine what would that be? 1/4000th of the thickness of your fingernail. Very, very, very thin. Very, very thin. Okay? So oxygen doesn't have to go that far. And you can imagine that, like, inundating such a fragile, delicate surface with cigarette smoke or whatever it is that you're inhaling or smoking. Well, I just learned last night about Tide Pods. Jesus Christ. So out of it. That's good. Fine by me. I don't need to be in that. So it's so narrow. This diffusion is so rapid due to the thinness of this membrane. All right. So let's look at an overview of respiration. What are the steps? You can divide respiration into external respiration and internal respiration. So external respiration is everything that happens up to getting the oxygen into the blood. And then internal respiration is everything that happens once that oxygen's been delivered to the target tissues. All right. External has pulmonary ventilation, that's moving the air in and out. Gas diffusion, which happens across that teeny tiny little 0.5 micron membrane I talked about. Then there's the transport with the hemoglobin. That's the interesting stuff. That's where we're going here. And then there's internal respiration, which is also very interesting. A lot of biochemistry that we probably will touch on a little bit when we get to the GI chapter. So abnormal, a couple definitions here. Abnormal external respiration is dangerous. Indeed. Hypoxia is low tissue oxygen levels. This comes from not being able to breathe enough. So Eric Gardner, for example, who the police jumped on that guy, he couldn't breathe, and caused him to go into anoxia, complete lack of oxygen. He died. He died. It is dangerous to mess with someone's ability to breathe. Dangerous and criminal. Apnea is a temporary cessation of breathing, particularly during sleep. All right. So, does anybody know anybody with apnea? I do. Yeah. My spouse actually has a little bit of this, which can be a little bit disconcerting sometimes. But there are ways of dealing with it. Yeah. So let's go back to high school. High school. I don't know. Is this chemistry or physics? It's all a blur. So Boyle's law, which is a subset of the ideal gas law, states that pressure is inversely related to volume. So that means that as volume goes down, pressure goes up. All right. Did I do that? Come on back. And conversely, when volume goes up, pressure goes down. So here is Luke and crew in the trash compactor, and the pressure is the volume is going down, and their pressure is going up as the volume goes down. Meanwhile, here's Luke from an earlier episode where he's in this wide open space, very idyllic, kind of low pressure, comparatively low pressure, right? So large volume, low pressure, Boyle's law. Why am I asking about that? Why am I showing you that? Well, that's exactly how pulmonary ventilation works, of course. So if you want to breathe in, inhalation, we are going to increase the volume of the lungs, and in so doing, decrease the pressure in the lungs. And that lower pressure in the lungs relative to the outside world is going to bring air into the lungs. So the higher atmospheric pressure will force its way into the negative pressure of the lungs. And then conversely, expiration or exhalation, we're going to decrease the volume of the lungs and increase the air pressure and then force air out of the lungs. All right. This is like some yoga diagram here showing that there's this like pelvic diaphragm and abdominal compartment is also involved in creating the change in volume for the chest cavity. All right, so let's get this down. We're going to zoom in on exactly how gas exchange happens. I did ventilation. The next step in external respiration is gas exchange. So gas exchange happens across this teeny tiny 0.5 micron respiratory membrane. And so right here in the air around us, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 torr, right? So atmospheric pressure is what, 760 torr? Is that it? That's the number, yeah. 760 torr. 100 of that, 100 millimeters of mercury are for the oxygen, and about 40 millimeters of mercury are for the carbon dioxide, although that number is going up. Here comes some deoxy blood from our tissues. And that blood that's being delivered from our tissues has a partial pressure of oxygen that's around 40 and a partial pressure of carbon dioxide that's around 45. So when it gets here, higher pressure of oxygen on the outside than on the inside, there's going to be a net diffusion of oxygen in this direction into the blood. And since carbon dioxide is higher in the blood than it is out in the world, there's going to be a net efflux of carbon dioxide. So that the blood leaving the lung is going to more or less match the profile in the atmosphere. And you can imagine what may happen if we get to the, I don't know. I've always wondered about this. What happens when we get to higher levels of carbon dioxide? Is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide going to be able to change enough so that it's more difficult to breathe? I don't know. So then by the time the blood reaches the tissue, the reverse happens, right? So the partial pressure of oxygen here is about 40. Your blood is around 100. It's down a little bit. It got nicked. A little bit of it got nicked on the way to the heart. And we get gas exchange and then send this deoxy blood back to the lungs. Okay? Does that make sense? That's pretty straightforward. It's a pretty straightforward idea. All right, we're going to wade into a little bit deeper water here. Who's talked about hemoglobin in their classes before? A few of you, half of you. Okay. So hemoglobin is a globin molecule. It's a tetramer made up of 2 alpha and 2 beta, or 2, I guess, alpha and 2 beta subunits. And in each of these subunits, there is this what's called porphyrin ring. The porphyrin ring, when it is bound iron, is called the heme. So this is a heme right here. Every red blood cell, of which there are trillions, I forget the number, there's trillions in you. Each red blood cell has 280 million hemoglobin molecules. Whew, it's a lot. There's a lot. So iron likes to bind oxygen. We know that right here. Here's this heart of steel molecule in 2005, in 2006, the following year, by this guy Julian Vos-André, showing a single globin molecule with the heme and the iron at the middle, rusting with time. So let's look a little bit closer at a single globulin subunit. So when the iron that's in the 2+ oxidation state, it binds the oxygen, binds dimolecular, diatomic oxygen, it forms the superoxide anion. So it changes the oxidation state of the iron from 2+ to 3+, and that charge is offset by the formation of the superoxide ion, which is relatively stable. When the oxidation state of iron changes, so here we are, we're looking in the plane of this porphyrin ring. When this oxidation state changes because of binding to oxygen, there is a subtle shift in the architecture of that trampoline. Yeah, it shifts upwards just a bit, and there's a couple reasons for that. There's a mass effect. There's a mass effect in either side of this fulcrum point, and changes in the valence shell structure of the electrons in the iron also lead to changes in the porphyrin ring, which is a highly conjugated pi system. That's just for the biochemists at heart out there. Okay, so this is all the root of what's called allosteria. This conformational shift in the porphyrin ring gives rise to the phenomenon of allosteria. So what does that word mean for those of you who haven't heard the term before? It's simply an alteration in the activity of a protein through the binding of an effector, in this case, oxygen, an effector molecule at the specific site, that site being the porphyrin ring. All right? Allosteria. So that means that in this case, when hemoglobin, so the job of hemoglobin is to bind oxygen. And there are 4 subunits, right? So how many oxygen molecules can one hemoglobin molecule, one hemoglobin tetramer bind? 4, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, it can bind 4. So that means when it binds 1, binding of that oxygen is going to change the ability of the protein to bind oxygen at the other 3 sites. Does that make sense? So imagine it like this. There are 4 beach balls. You've got 4 beach balls, and you're going to throw them to me. You throw me one, I grab it, no problem, got it. And then Holden's going to throw me the second one. She throws me a beach ball. Boop, got that one. No problem. But Annabelle doesn't want to be left out. She throws a beach ball, and whoo, got that one. Right? But my ability to hold that third beach ball is not, I can't hold it quite as well as I could hold the first 2. And Grace has this sort of dark sense of humor and wants to see me, I don't know if you do or not, but wants to throw a beach ball at me and see what happens. She throws another beach ball. I get it. But it's really hard to hold on to that one, right? Because I grab it. And that's what allosteria is here. I wasn't. All right. So what happens is there's a conformational shift. When you have deoxyhemoglobin, the orientation of these subunits with respect to one another is shifted by about 15 degrees relative to what you see in oxyhemoglobin, right? And that's all because of the subtle shift in the structure of the porphyrin ring leads to allosteria. We can quantify it. All right, so here's a picture. You can see on the right-hand side, so now, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side, now, and now, right? You can see the oxygen appearing right here, right there, and right there. So that is in the oxy state, or no, it's the oxy state, and then the other is the deoxy state. And you get this shift. Again, you can see it on this side. So here it is getting oxygenated and deoxygenated. You get this subtle shift in the architecture of the globin subunit. All right. So then this is the real denouement of all of this, and let's try to walk our way through this chart. Let's try to walk our way through the chart. So when you're looking at this chart, at this diagram, the thing to keep in mind is this is not representing a single hemoglobin molecule. This is representing a huge population of them, all right? We're going to be imagining all of the hemoglobins in your blood at a certain point. So along the y-axis, we have, along the x-axis, we'll do there, is the partial pressure of oxygen. Just the ambient partial pressure of oxygen that a hemoglobin molecule may find itself in. And then along the y-axis, for a given partial pressure of oxygen, what percentage of sites, possible oxygen binding sites, is going to be occupied. We can call this percent saturation. All right? And this doesn't mean that if we're, for example, at 75%, that absolutely all of the hemoglobin molecules have 3 out of their 4 sites occupied. It just means that in the population of hemoglobin, that 75% of the sites are occupied. Many, maybe probably most of those hemoglobin do have 3 sites occupied and the 4th empty, but that's not the rule here, right? It means that of the possible binding sites, 75% are occupied. So if we look now at 2 different concentrations of oxygen, we look at around 40 or so torr or millimeters of mercury versus 100 millimeters of mercury. So this is where our arteries are at, and this is where our veins are at. If you look at the saturation, we see that in our veins, we have about a 75% saturation. Whereas in our arteries, we have 100% saturation. When we are at the lungs, we're way over here. All right, we're way over here. The hemoglobin's job is to pick up as much oxygen as we can. So it does. It gets to the peripheral tissues, and what happens? Does it unload all of its oxygen? No, it doesn't. It only unloads, actually, on average, 1 of the 4 it's carrying. It only unloads 1 of the 4 it's carrying. And then it goes back. So this is where you're at rest. What the hell is going on? I thought the job was to move oxygen. Does anyone want to speculate as to what's happening here? Why? Give me a physiological, evolutionary rationale. Use that critical thinking for which you're so renowned. What do you think? Take a stab. Take a wild stab. There's a clue on here already. I put at rest. What happens if... Well, yeah. So what happens if our partial pressure of oxygen starts to go down in our tissues? Maybe because we're exercising, right? Or maybe because we've fallen in a pond and we're underwater and can't breathe. Maybe somebody is choking us. We can't breathe for some reason. Something is occluding our airway. There's 3/4 of the oxygen our hemoglobin is carrying is in reserve. It's in reserve. All right? In case things start to get hairy. It's in reserve. And you can see if you begin to drop below this, it doesn't take a radical change in partial pressure of oxygen for our hemoglobin to recognize, uh-oh, because the slope of this curve is much steeper here. Whereas up here, it's not nearly as steep. It's much steeper here. If we start sliding down this way, we know something's wrong. We need to mobilize that oxygen as rapidly as we can. All right? Oxygen is going to come off more easily. So allosteria gives us this sort of 2-phased curve, 2 different distinct parts of the curve that have 2 physiological roles. You guys see that? Allosteria. In fact, allosteria in hemoglobin, it was the first example of allosteria that was discovered and described, and it's one of the most complex. In graduate school, when I was at Notre Dame, there was a guy, Tom, what was his name? Nowak. Tom Nowak was his name. He was on my graduate committee. He taught a whole semester-long class on kinetics, enzyme kinetics, and they only talked about hemoglobin. Graduate course, the whole semester. It's super complicated. But this is like the first layer of a many-shelled onion. And we're going to go a couple more layers in here. So what I just said, all of that anticipated this. Here we are. This is the 21% of the oxygen or so that is delivered from the lungs to the tissue. All right? So about 21% of the oxygen carrying capacity of your hemoglobin is what is typically being utilized. You start exercising or whatever, and you're shifting a much smaller proportion of in terms of your partial pressure of oxygen, but you're at a much more rapid release. So this is exactly what I was just saying. This slide is just a different way of explicitly looking at it. All right. So I want to talk about this slide. Probably should cut this one up. This is another way to think about it. It's the same thing. It's another way to think about it. This is kind of opening up that, taking a layer off and seeing that it gets a little more complex. There is an equilibrium between what's called the T or tight state and R or relaxed state. All right. So, I showed those GIFs or whatever that kind of pretended like oxygen binds and it automatically goes to the southern conformation, right? That is actually not the case. The oxygen will bind and it is then in equilibrium between a tight and a relaxed state. And you can be, so for example, when you're binding oxygen, when you're at the lungs, this R state or relaxed state, the state that allows oxygen to bind is strongly favored. But you can be in the T state. There's an equilibrium between that. And this is a kinetic phenomenon. And then conversely, over here, when there's no oxygen, this T state is strongly favored. But not exclusively. Probably get rid of that slide, actually. All right. The point is, of all this T state, R state stuff, is that our curve looks sinusoidal, right? Or sigmoidal, I guess. It has these two inflection points. And that is a combination of curves for two things. There's an R state, if like the molecule was stuck in the R state and not able to transition back and forth, this is actually what the curve would look like, the blue dotted line. And then if it were stuck in the T state, this is what it would look like. So this would be like the peripheral tissue description of what oxygen binding. And this would be the like at the lung description of what binding would look like. But in fact, since there are these two binding states, they can combine and form this observed binding curve that I initially shown you. So am I going, I know some of you said you had seen hemoglobin before. Am I going a little beyond what was described to you before? Maybe a little, just a bit. Is anyone getting lost in the woods? Maybe there's got to be some of you, a little bit. Okay. If you were to, I know this is an oxymoron, but if you were to describe for me what it was that you don't understand, how would that description be? Or are you guys good? You ready to keep going? Okay. So oxygen is actually not the only effector. It's not the only thing that changes the binding capacity of hemoglobin. There's this stuff called 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Who's had central metabolism before? And you guys had central metabolism? Like glycolysis and stuff. Anyways, a little bit. You remember 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate at all? Yeah. Well, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is a biochemical intermediate from central metabolism. And it turns out that 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate stabilizes the T state. stabilizes. It helps to stabilize the T state, and it's what gives us the curve that we see, the presence of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate in the tissues, in our peripheral tissues, in metabolically active tissues, tissues that are breaking down glucose, burning energy, consuming oxygen, right? They're producing this 2,3-BPG or it's also called 2,3-DAG, diacylglycerol is another word you'll see. But 2,3-BPG or DAG, same molecule. Anyways, this stuff is stabilizing the T state and shifting the curve from what it would be here to this. All right, so this means that at serious exercise, when the ambient concentration of oxygen at our peripheral tissues drops from 40 down to 20, we are delivering, rather than what would be 8%, we are delivering 66% of the blood. All right, so when the oxygen that's in our blood. Right, when there's a demand for oxygen, we're able to deliver it. And 2,3-BPG is the molecular signal that says the cells are metabolically active. We're going to switch the hemoglobin into this high delivery mode. It stabilizes the T state such that when the hemoglobin is at the peripheral tissues, it's going to deliver the bulk of the oxygen, 2/3 of the oxygen, rather than just 10% or so. You guys following me? You following this? If you're not, don't be shy. Okay. And how does that work? Well, 2,3-BPG, maybe I'll talk about something you guys like. How about donuts? Hemoglobin kind of looks like a donut. And you guys like donuts? And it sits there right in the middle, and it's kind of like the donut hole. What are those things called? Yeah, just donut holes. A donut hole. It just sits in the middle and stabilizes the T state. And if you were to remove that, you would be able to rotate those subunits with respect to one another by the 15 degrees that I showed maybe about 5-10 slides ago. Remember I showed the picture of hemoglobin, deoxy, and oxy, and it had rotated 15%, or 15 degrees. The diacylglycerol prevents that by inserting itself right in the middle, the intersection of all 4 of those subunits. In fact, it's the beta subunits that it's interacting. All right. Okay, let's not worry. Okay, this is actually pretty interesting. So fetuses, they don't have alpha and beta. They have alpha and what's called gamma. They have a gamma. They have the alpha like adults, but they have a gamma subunit, which the principal distinction here is that in the gamma subunit is just like the beta, except this histidine is replaced with these 2 histidines in the beta are replaced with a serine in the gamma subunit. And getting rid of this histidine makes this 2,3-BPG much less happy in fetal hemoglobin than adult hemoglobin. As a consequence, the T state is less stabilized. The T state is less stabilized because 2,3-BPG stabilizes the T state. All right? And because of that, fetal hemoglobin saturation curve is going to resemble more like the R state. It's going to shift to the left and look more like the R state. We'll see what that means in a minute here. But basically, fetal hemoglobin is not going to have as much 2,3-BPG in the center as adult hemoglobin is going to have. All right? So let's see what impact that has. Mom is in blue, baby's in red here. What happens is that blood that is at the peripheral tissues, specifically the placenta, for mom's down here around 0.3 saturation, baby's up here around 0.6. Baby wins. Fetal hemoglobin is going to, on average, across millions and millions of molecules of hemoglobin, is going to be pulling oxygen to it from the mother. All right. So here's maternal hemoglobin with the alpha and beta, and here's the fetal with alpha and gamma, where that histidine has been changed to a serine, and 2,3-BPG does not fit in the binding pocket and stabilize the T state. All right? This is how babies are able to draw oxygen off of the mother competitively. Has anyone ever been around a pregnant woman through term and hung out with her? No? Yeah, a little. Yeah. And so what happens? In the beginning, you get the morning sickness, and then second trimester, especially third trimester, what starts happening to that woman? Obviously, she's growing, but she also starts to lose her breath pretty easily, right? They have a hard time keeping up with that. There's a couple reasons. There's an increased hemoglobin demand. She's trying to grow more, and if she's not getting enough oxygen, she's not building enough red cells to feed the extra body tissue she has. But secondly, the hemoglobin is competing against the little parasite in her. Actually, that's horrible. Against the baby. The baby's taking the oxygen off of her hemoglobin. Okay, so that's fetal hemoglobin. Really interesting. It's a doorway. I just showed you maybe the second shell in a much deeper onion. Hemoglobin is a very sophisticated molecule. So the presence of metabolic intermediates, 2,3-BPG, which is being produced by tissues that are respiring, internal respiration. That's the thing. So 2,3-BPG is basically a chemical signal, a chemical byproduct or a signal of increased internal respiration. And because of that, it has an effect on the ability of hemoglobin to deliver blood. That's the biggest summary I can give of that concept. It's not the only thing that can be an effector on hemoglobin saturation. There's pH, which is called the Bohr effect. This is named after Christian Bohr, not Niels Bohr, the guy of the first quantum mechanical description of, so it's Christian Bohr. And then there's also a temperature dependence that you see right here. So let's look at this. Here, 7.4, the purple line in the middle, that is normal blood pH, right? Because your pH range is 7.35 to 7.45. That's right in the middle. You guys all happily sitting there. If you shift towards acidosis, that's going to shift the curve towards the T state. All right? T state being the one favored at peripheral tissues. T state being the scenario that is going to want to offload oxygen. So for a particular partial pressure of oxygen, right here, for example, when you go towards acidosis, so here we are, we're going towards acidosis, we're going to unload more oxygen, all right? We're going to unload more oxygen at that same partial pressure of oxygen. That should make sense. Think about that. Acidosis happens when you're producing lots of carbon dioxide, you're running, you're respiring, the pH of your blood is going down, it's getting more acidic, and we need to deliver oxygen more efficiently. So it's going to shift the curve and allow us to deliver more oxygen for the same partial pressure, right? And the opposite is true for alkalosis when you shift the pH the other way. So pH has an effect. And I'm not going to go through the molecular details of it, but you can take my word for it. Another one is temperature. Same deal here. What gets you heated? Exercise, right? And as you're exercising, say you're exercising here is normal up here. This is the partial pressure of oxygen. This is your delivery saturation. And then you come down here and you heat a person up to 38 degrees and they start offloading a lot more oxygen. All right? The body's creating metabolic energy. The hemoglobin is delivering oxygen better. So again, I advocate that you think about these and the fetal hemoglobin. Think about these starting from the big picture down. Like what happens when you get hot? When you're exercising, you want to deliver more oxygen. What happens when you are in acidosis? You're exercising, you want to deliver more oxygen for at a given partial pressure. What happens with a fetus? A fetus wants to take oxygen from the mother, preferentially at a particular partial pressure. If you think about it rationally from like what is the top-down objective of the physiological response, then you'll be able to like reproduce that without having to have memorized it. Does that make sense? So think of the larger physiological rationale underneath it. There's so much more. There's so much more. There's another one. There's the effect of carbon dioxide. There's the effect of carbon monoxide. So here's the Bohr effect, and then here's the Bohr effect with carbon dioxide laid on top of it. And this makes sense too, right? So if there's more carbon dioxide present, then that means you are at a highly respiring cell, so you're going to want to unload more oxygen there as well. Does that make sense? Again, same rationale. You want to reproduce any of these effects, just think about rationally what would cause that scenario. Like why would there be carbon dioxide around, and then what effect would you want to have? Presence of carbon dioxide, the more carbon dioxide, the more you're going to want to unload oxygen to the tissues. All right. And then, of course, there's carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a real problem because it is not just an effector, it's a competitive inhibitor. No one in here has taken biochemistry yet, right? No one's, yeah, okay. Well, it's a competitive inhibitor, and that means that it's actually trying to leap onto the actual porphyrin ring. It wants to bind to the iron. So it's competing against oxygen, and it's a competitive inhibitor. It's inhibiting the ability of oxygen to bind because it's competitively occupying those sites. And carbon monoxide sucks. I was in a band. I've been in many bands. So I was in a band in Ann Arbor when I lived there, and this guy that was really cool. He would record all the bands in town. Great engineer, nice recording studio. Thankless task. Made no money. Lived in a crappy trailer with his mom, and they had a crummy furnace, and it pumped out a bunch of carbon monoxide. Him and his mom both died in their sleep. So I've had people die because of this. It has a binding constant that's 200 times larger than that of oxygen for hemoglobin. So when exposed to oxygen versus carbon monoxide, the hemoglobin will always go for the carbon monoxide. Not always, but pretty much, mostly. And it dramatically decreases your ability to saturate with oxygen. All right, and it stays on there. It doesn't come off. It stays on there. It doesn't come off easily. It comes off very slowly. So it's cumulative. A little bit of exposure to carbon monoxide chronically can lead to a real dangerous thing. This is what happens in your sleep. So you had all these, look at that. It was a different time. Academia is different. I'm glad there's so many non-smoking females in the room here. That's great. But back when this photo was taken, look at that. This guy's trying to teach. Everybody's just puffing away as if that helps them think or makes them cooler or something. Nothing's going to make that guy cooler. But it's actually, a bad idea. I used to teach in Texas. I already said that today. And when I taught down there, I'd have to walk into the building through this cloud of cigarette smoke to get into the building. All these people were out there before the exam just trying to take down a cigarette in 2 breaths as if that was going to help them because they were nervous or whatever. That's the worst thing you can do before an exam. It is the worst thing you can do because you are definitely inhaling some carbon monoxide in that cigarette. Okay. So here's a summary slide. I talked about a lot of things there, didn't I? So this is just a summary of all of it, most of it, not all of it. So things that are going to shift us this way are a decrease in temperature and a decrease in carbon dioxide is going to shift us in that direction. So less carbon dioxide, less of a need to deliver oxygen at a particular partial pressure. Decrease in 2, 3, so it's DAG or DPG or BPG. They have all these different names. But this effector here, the 2, 3, decrease in that is also going to signal that we have a reduced metabolic need. We're not producing as much of this intermediate. This means our cells are not respiring as much. It means we're not going to stabilize the T state as much. It means we will not deliver as much oxygen for a given partial pressure. And then increased pH, that's the alkalosis. So then on the other flip side of the coin is just all the converse. So increase in temperature, signaling exercise, will deliver a higher amount of oxygen at the same partial pressure. Increased PCO2, same thing. And 2,3 BPG or DPG is going to signal that there is metabolic activity. Then if you have a lower pH, that's because these two would go together, right? These two would go together. So if you have increased partial pressure carbon dioxide, that's going to lower your pH. You're going to have more carbonic acid as well. So that's a summary of the last 15 slides or whatever. I don't want to make your heads hurt too much with this slide. We've been talking about oxygen delivery, but carbon dioxide is part of the equation too, right? So I talked about oxygen binding and then delivery and dissociation and diffusion into the cells. But these cells make carbon dioxide as well. And the transference of carbon dioxide to the epithelial surfaces is actually a little bit more sophisticated in some ways. So we have some carbon dioxide that's just going to dissolve in the blood. And then the rest is going to be picked up by the red blood cells, some of which is going to bind to hemoglobin, because hemoglobin, carbon dioxide, is an effector of hemoglobin. And then some of it is going to get converted to carbonic acid, which then is bicarbonate. And bicarbonate can go through what's called the chloride shift. So bicarbonate can be exported into the serum of the blood and in an anti-transport with chloride, so that we have a charge balance. This is called the chloride shift. So cells suck up chloride, export carbonate anion, and the carbonate buffers the blood and gets transferred through the blood. Then we get to the lungs, where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is such that we're going to diffuse carbon dioxide off. And all these reverse processes happen. So we do the reverse of the chloride shift and reform carbonic acid, which then is converted to CO2. Hemoglobin gives up the carbon dioxide and the stuff that was just dissolved in the blood. All of that is going to cross that respiratory membrane. So anybody who, is there anyone who, I know where some of you guys are from. I actually know where everyone's from. Is anyone from the mountains? No one? Has anyone ever exercised much in the mountains, like high elevation? Well, altitude affects the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, and that's going to affect the relative ability. It's going to affect the saturation dynamics of the hemoglobin. And this is why marathon runners, a lot of them train way up here. You train way up there for a long time because you're mucking with the saturation dynamics of the hemoglobin. And so the body responds and it's just going to produce more hemoglobin, right? One of the ways that you can dope your blood is to get a transfusion of pure cell pack before a race or something like that. It's illegal, of course, but or in competitive sports, it's illegal. But that's going to pump up your hemoglobin and get sort of artificially the same thing that you would get by just training at a high altitude in the Andes or the Rockies or someplace like that. Run around. Okay. So I've only got 5 minutes. Do you guys really want to hear about the autonomic control of this? I don't think you do. I'm going to skip these slides. How about that? Is that okay? And this is the same thing. This is integrating those two slides, so we'll skip all that. We'll just talk about smoking. The gross anatomy of smokers' lungs. Okay. I don't know. This is probably redundant. I've always, when I started teaching A&P in Texas, I was shocked at how many young people smoked around there. Colby is a totally different place. And so I always have felt the imperative of talking about this to young people. Maybe it's quaint to talk about how bad smoking is, but I still see all kinds of people smoking out there. It breaks my heart because it's just such a easily avoidable health burden on our society, on individuals, on families. It's just why pay some company? Why make some company wealthy to kill yourself? It's just such a. Anyways, all right. Let's look at this. So the blue line is hopefully everyone in the room never smoked. However, a regular smoker, this is looking at, so this is age versus percent respiratory performance, all right? And your respiratory performance goes down with age no matter who you are. It just does, okay? But if you're a smoker, it goes down fairly rapidly. And the thing about it is, once you stop smoking, it's not like the game is over for you. You're going to continue to slide. You actually, once you stop smoking, this curve here mirrors the trajectory of a non-smoker. So you're not going to recover that capacity, but you're going to stop the rapidity of your decline. You're going to stop the acceleration of your decline, okay? And then you reach disability and death at a much earlier state than a person who has never smoked. Yeah. There's a picture on the right of a smoker's lung versus non-smoker on the left. Look at those pink lungs, so much nicer. The proportion of lung cancer by cause is grossly skewed towards smoking. So 90% of the people who get lung cancer get it because of smoking cigarettes. All right. This isn't to say that there aren't other reasons. So, like, radon is something to think about here in Maine because radon it's a noble gas. It doesn't combine easily. It's not easy to deal with chemically because it's a noble gas. And it is radioactive. It is in the geology around here. It will seep into basements, particularly basements that are sitting on ledge. If you want to deal with it, you can just get a little vent. You can vent it out or whatever. All right, smoking. So let's keep looking here. NIH estimate that lung cancer care costs in the U.S. in 2015, which I admit is 3 years old, that was $13 billion. On top of lost productivity from lung cancer is an additional $36 billion. That is, $50 billion out of the U.S. GDP. That's about $150 per person per year that you paid and I paid and all of us paid because of the burden of the smokers around us. So what are these other statistics? I love statistics like this. So about 220,000 new cases of lung cancer, pretty evenly divided between men and women, and about 150 deaths per year. So we're getting a little better at caring for them. And then let's look here. So I admit that this trajectory cuts out at 2008, but this shows an alarming trend. Right around the I don't actually remember it. It was Dare, the kids don't do drugs thing, but I don't remember what the anti-smoking initiative in the 80s. It just started to decline from that. So numbers for men have gone down, but women have, it's been an equal opportunity marketing for cigarette companies. They saw a decline in the market for men, and so there was a stronger and stronger push as societal norms continued to change to market towards women and make it predate upon the the female population, and try to make up for lost market share of men. So the women's numbers have gone up, have kind of begun to plateau around 2000, but it's closed the gap between men and women for sure. So that's an alarming trend. What does it say here? $10.3 billion per year is spent in the U.S. on lung cancer treatment alone. Just on lung cancer, we spend $10 billion. Yeah. And a large portion of these deaths a disproportionate portion. If you look at demographics in the country of by ethnic origin, a disproportionate number of this is in the African American community. So black men are 20 to 30% more likely to develop lung cancer than white men. All right, and this is because these predatory cigarette companies have gone after inner city communities, after African American smokers. So good, it's got to be cool. I find this to be despicable. But this is a real concern in our society. Another example of inequality. All right. Recap. Respiratory anatomy. I went over that briefly. I talked about ventilation, the mechanics of ventilation. I then talked about internal versus external respiration, and then within external respiration, I talked about ventilation, then gas exchange, then we moved to internal respiration and, transport. I talked about hemoglobin saturation dynamics. That was probably the biggest chunk of the class. A little bit of carbon dioxide transport, and then I got on my soapbox about lung cancer. That was that. Are there any questions? I went a couple minutes over. Okay, thank you. Have a lovely day, everybody. I know it's crummy weather out there, but have a lovely day.